I've been sick of the sound of my own voice since I was young. Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode number 1 of Increments with Ben and Vaden.
That was sensual. That sounded very sensual.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out the intro voice. But yeah, so today's episode is about epistemic modesty. And in what you're about to listen to, we start with epistemic modesty, quickly get sidetracked, and start arguing about consequentialism for like an hour and a half. And it's not until the second episode that we bring it back to the subject of epistemic modesty. So if listeners are wondering what the fuck's going on, it's so are we, basically. But we eventually do bring it back, but you'll have to wait till the next episode to get that. Cool. See you on the other side. So the subject today is epistemic modesty, which I guess is slightly a term of art in the rationalist community. There's a few blog posts written about it, one from Eliezer Yudkowsky in defense of a non-modest epistemology, so having strong opinions and holding to them. And then there's another blog post written in defense of epistemic modesty, saying basically we should be careful to hold too strongly to our own opinions and defer to experts a bit more often than we're perhaps used to. And so both Ben and I are kind of known for having strong political and strong opinions both in the political and the moral sphere, but it's interesting to kind of investigate like how we first form these opinions and when we should change them, and just how do we negotiate in a world where we think we're right, but there's also a lot of people who we respect who also think they're right. And so that's kind of the space of what we're going to be discussing today. And so I guess the first place that may be interesting to start is just, Ben, what do you think what are some of the opinions you hold pretty strongly now, and what would make you change them? Or if you don't think you change them, why? Like, how do you justify the strong opinions that you hold?
Yeah, so are we talking political opinions specifically at the moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this might be slightly unhelpful now, actually. I think because I've come across notions like epistemic modesty, I'm incredibly confused at the moment about a lot of political opinions. And in parallel to this, actually, because I'm being exposed right now more to the world of like economics and how research is actually done, I'm beginning to come across a lot of like the sources of our quote unquote knowledge about a lot of political topics, right? Like whether we're talking about does taxation work, does raising the minimum wage work, does allowing people do open carry laws reduce crime rates, these kind of things. And I'm kind of seeing how all this research is actually carried out.
Interesting.
And yeah, a lot of it is
that making you start to doubt yourself?
Yeah, it's not as robust as you'd like it to be, probably, as someone from the outside. So all this right now is causing me to hold my political opinions, I think, a little less strongly. But to answer your question, I guess a little more honestly, like I definitely have liberal leanings, right? So I definitely think like vast inequality is a problem. I think vast, especially like inequality of opportunity, is a huge problem. And I think, we've talked about like free will to some extent. And I just think like people are born into the circumstances that they are with, a certain IQ, parents that have the ability to like encourage them only so far as they can to like pursue education and things like this, and just the way opportunity is distributed is just not equal, right? And so this definitely informs my political opinions and definitely pushes me more towards the left and more towards sort of redistributive policies.
So I want to dive into the question of taxation. So that's an interesting one for me personally, because both of us, I think, grew up in let's say left of center households. Both of us, I think, have done a lot of work trying to understand positions on the other side. So on the other side of the aisle. Taxation is one that I've always been stuck on, and taxation and minimum wage questions, because upon reading both sides, I find that I'm kind of in a deadlock. Both sides seem to be making reasonable arguments. Say one side saying we need to increase taxes in order to put more money into public services and then kind of redistribute wealth. And the other side says that, well, you can't increase taxes too much because then that will hurt the free market, and by hurting the free market, you're hurting one of the main generators of wealth. And so I guess I'm really curious to know what your position is on that question, being kind of on the other side of the curtain, so to speak. If there is a consensus in the economics department which you find yourself, or if it's as messy on the other side of the curtain as it is on this side of it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, just to also put my cards on the table, like I'm not actually an economist. I'm more sort of like a data scientist at the law school. And so my background's not in economics or math and computer science, but I'm definitely more exposed to real economists in this position than I've ever been before, and definitely have a peek behind the curtain as to how this research is often carried out. But to answer your question, I think in general, I'm pretty sympathetic actually to raising taxes and raising the minimum wage, mostly because I think the empirical evidence basically points to the fact that raising the minimum wage does not reduce employment. So maybe just give a bit of background. Like one of the arguments against raising the minimum wage is that it will actually cause employers to cut down on employment, and this is actually going to be hurting the poor, right? This is going to be hurting the very people you hope to help, right? So yes, those people who will be employed will be getting paid more, and that's great, but this will actually force employers to just cut many more jobs like this, and so you'll actually have many more unemployed people. So that's kind of like the classic.
This is the argument against raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, precisely. And this, to my eyes, just basically an empirical claim, right? This is like an empirical claim about people's psychology, how they act under increased taxation, and just how complex economic networks actually function in practice. And based on my understanding of the literature at the moment, there's just not strong evidence to suggest that modest increases in the minimum wage actually hurt. Actually hurt job retention among lower income people. So that would be my take on the minimum wage at the moment. And also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then the take on taxation is sort of similar. I think, again, this is kind of an empirical question, and my current understanding of the literature is that increased taxation doesn't reduce people's incentives. It doesn't lower productivity among the wealthy. So again, to just give the background of the argument, the argument against taxation is that if you tax people too heavily, you're going to reduce their incentive to work and be productive, right? And then this is actually going to hurt the very system of wealth accumulation, and then everyone's going to be poorer off, right? Because now we don't have people producing the goods and services that we actually rely on. And it seems like at the moment that's just kind of false, right? And I think this is actually pretty intuitive if you think about the psychology. I think what drives people insofar as status is concerned is the status with respect to their peers and neighbors, and it's a relative status as opposed to an absolute status. So if the absolute cap on income in some world is $2 million, you just want to be at that cap, and you want your neighbor to be making $1 million less than you, and so you actually care about the relative difference between you and your neighbors as opposed to the absolute amount of money you're making. That's kind of my take right now, just based on how I interpret the literature.
That's excellent. So okay, so let's kind of think a bit about how you arrived at that position, which is, I think, similar to the way that I thought through it as well, which is people on the left say one thing, people on the right say another thing. Both arguments seem relatively persuasive, and at this particular question, we need to turn to the data. It's an empirical question, and we need to say that there is no way to say kind of a priori who's correct, so we need to just investigate. I've heard something similar when it comes to the kind of icky concept of actually. let me change the metaphor because we need not go there. We could use the idea of do video games cause an increase in violence, where some people say that violent video games will create an incentive for people to go out and actually do violence in person, and other people say, well, violent video games are just going to keep all the violent people at home playing video games, and that will reduce actually people going outside.
Right.
And so it's an empirical question. So we agree that one should be kind of epistemically modest when there's strong arguments on both sides and there's the ability to get data. But if we move the question to, say, the more moral sphere, where it's really difficult to get empirical data, then what do we do? So, for example, let's choose consequentialism versus deontology versus virtue ethics.
Sure.
How do we start to justify and think through these kinds of moral frameworks when there's it's hard to just turn to the data? I guess it's maybe not a question directly to you, but I could pose it as a question to you. But it's something that maybe we could explore together because it's not an easy question to resolve.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to resolve, and I think it's sort of bizarre actually that people don't give this more thought. So Will MacAskill, who is a philosopher at Oxford, has this great line where he says, basically people are pretty good typically about making decisions under uncertainty, right? So if you're like waking up and trying to go about your day, there's like all sorts of uncertainty associated with it, right? Like if you go to school, you might get hit by a car, and we're able to sort of rationally weigh the pros and cons of different decisions. And most of the time, if the decision's actually like important to us, we kind of do this as like an expected value calculation, right? And we just kind of go like, yeah, this action might have a really bad effect, but the probability is sufficiently low. I'm not really going to pay attention to it, yada, yada, yada. But the point is that we take into account lots of possible options of what could be happening, right? Like lots of possible truths. Whereas in the moral sphere, Will says that we sort of adopt like a football fan ideology here, whereas like we pick a certain moral team and then we just stick with it no matter what, right? So we we pick consequentialism, for example, just because we find the reasoning as compelling or more compelling rather than any of the other sort of moral frameworks out there. And then we just say, that's it. I'm a consequentialist. I'm going to analyze everything via this lens, and I'm not going to pay attention to any sort of virtue ethics considerations or Kantian considerations, any of from any other moral viewpoint. And this is like pretty bizarre, right? There's no reason that this should be the case. And anyway, this actually spun off like a sort of this field of research kind of termed like, I guess, moral uncertainty, like making decisions under moral uncertainty. And I think my current thoughts are that we should actually be much more modest in our moral judgments than typically we are. So if you have like your credence, say, as like 50% in consequentialism, or even like 80%, I still think you should be taking into account what would be sort of the effects of your actions, or rather like how would your action look under different moral viewpoints. And I think that actually should inform our actions more than it does currently.
Ooh, fascinating. Okay, so yeah. I think that MacAskill, I obviously respect him as the person who started the effective altruism movement, and he's a great philosopher and thinker. But I don't necessarily agree that consequentialism is the same as the other two moral systems. I know that this is classically how it's taught, but so I'm very much a consequentialist in the sense of I think that to come to some sort of moral understanding, we need to argue and reason and discuss the consequences. But this is what we do in every area of life, in science and in relationships, and this is just how we arrive at any kind of understanding. What we do is we argue and debate and discuss the various possibilities and alternatives, and it's only through this process of debate and finding flaws in the other person's reasoning do we start to make progress. And so I say I'm a consequentialist because it is the quickest way for me to communicate to other people kind of how I reason through. But I don't think there's anything necessarily tribal about it. It's not that I it's not that I have found my team and I'm just going to argue consequentially against all the other teams, just come hell or high water. It's more that I think that the only way that we can make any progress in any domain at all is through the mechanism of discussion and debate. And in that sense, all there is to discuss are consequences.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's to be a consequentialist is, at least in my mind, that's really just to say that I'm applying the same principles of discussion and debate to the moral sphere as I do to every other sphere. If you compare it to, say, virtue ethicists who say that here's a set of virtues, and what's right is, say, to be noble or to be brave or to be whatever, then that is a way to end discussion. Or they say, well, no, you can argue and you can discuss about which virtues are better than which other virtues.
Yep.
And then I say, okay, great. If you're going to do that, how are you going to actually argue and discuss it? Well, you're going to talk about the consequences of these virtues. And so at the end, it always comes back to argument in critical discussion as being the driving mechanism. So I don't know. What do you have to say?
I think you're imposing your sort of lack of respect of other philosophical moral traditions into this discussion, right? So I think it's not fair to say that the deontologist or the virtue ethicist in this case would say, I believe in these 5 virtues and that's it. That's the end of the story. You should be acting this way no matter of the consequences. There's still lots of discussion to be had there, right? You can still sit down with a virtue ethicist and debate the pros and cons, how you weigh up different virtues, why they believe in virtue ethics as opposed to other things, right? And that's precisely you don't want to close off that debate. That's precisely the sort of the force driving moral uncertainty, is that you want to keep options open as opposed to just closing the door to other moral frameworks.
I guess it's less that I am disregarding the other frameworks. It's more them saying that they are all doing the same deeper thing. And the same thing that they're all doing is arguing and debating and discussing with reference to consequences at the end. And so it's not necessarily that I'm saying that the virtue ethicists and the deontologists, like, to be a deontologist, if you're going to argue for a rule-based framework, you are, of course, arguing that the rules are going to lead to better consequences. But it's not the other way around. It's the consequentialist doesn't have to, at all points, argue in terms of virtues or rules. To quote, be a consequentialist is just to say that any argument and any explanation is fair game, provided it is better than its alternatives. And so it's not that I am disregarding the other systems. It's just that I'm saying that they're all actually doing the same thing, whether they recognize it necessarily or not. But this, I think. Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess 2 things. One is that it's hard for me to argue with you because, I mean, I think I am much more sympathetic to consequentialism than any of the other moral frameworks at the end of the day, and for precisely this reason, because, like, anytime you push sort of like a deontologist about their views, at the end of the day, you have to say why something matters, and that why is always framed in terms of some sort of consequence, right? So I totally understand your critique there. But yeah, I guess I'm not convinced that you still can't have the conversation with the deontologist who's just because they are framing their moral beliefs in terms of whys, that's not like a reductio ad absurdum or something, and therefore Kantianism should be thrown out the door, right? It's just that's how they're arguing for their deontological beliefs, and I think now you have to take one step back and now say, okay, like, they're reasoning with me also about consequences, but for a different moral viewpoint, right? For deontology in this case. And what am I supposed to do about that? So if we're both arguing about consequences sort of at the end of the day, whatever, but the fact is they are arguing about it in terms of this other moral framework, right? And yeah, so like why do you get to take the inside view, I guess, on consequentialism, on consequentialism?
Consequentialism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I think about it very differently. I think that, so when I say I'm a consequentialist, it's only for kind of convenience of communication. People quickly know roughly where I stand. But
Sure, yeah.
in my bones, I don't wake up every day thinking, as a consequentialist, what do I have to do today? But what I do think in my bones is as a critical rationalist, which is very different from the rationalist community in the Bay Area. I am now learning. These are very different things.
Yes.
So I am not at all in favor of assigning little probability values to every piece of human cognition, which people like Eliezer Yudkowsky and them like to do. But I do think, so as a critical rationalist is something that I do quite identify. I think that identify as. I think that the only driver of progress we have is through critical discussion, criticism, debate, argumentation, conversation. These are my primitive objects. These are the most foundational concepts that I have. And so, on the topic of consequentialism and virtue ethics and deontology, I just see that as soon as you're having a conversation with somebody who is, say, claiming to be a deontologist, and they're trying to persuade and convince and argue with you about the value of their system, that they're, whether they recognize it or not, are all engaging in the same process, which I think is the fundamental driver of progress and knowledge and understanding, which is discussion and debate. And so I think the topic of this conversation is epistemic modesty, and you could quite fairly say, like, well, that's a very immodest claim that you're making, that this is how everything works. But really, this is essentially the only thing which I am immodest about, that one must debate and discuss with people who think differently than oneself. And after you make that foundational principle, that everything is debatable, everything is discussable, then all other higher order conversations are themselves the locus of where you should be modest and uncertain, and where you should seek truths and stuff. And so the topic of epistemic modesty as applied to morality, and going back to what Will MacAskill had said, which is, you have the consequentialists on one side, and they're on one team, and you have the deontologists, and they're on another team, and none of them are really modest. They're all just teaming up against their own, on their own sides against the other ones, I think is just completely missing the point. And the point is that the driver of progress is debate and discussion. And once you take that as a primitive, then every other topic is something that one should be open to learning about, I guess. And so that's kind of how I think about it, but maybe I should pass the torch back to you to see if that resonates, or if you think that I've made a flaw in reasoning somewhere.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I have two quick thoughts here, I guess. One is, you're pointing to something, if I'm not mistaken, I think you're pointing to something that I find also a little bit disturbing about epistemic modesty, and that's sort of a wisdom of the crowds type problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So honestly, in that fucking piece that I read, the one by Greg, what's his name? Like, it was almost creepy. So I want to go into this particular subject, but absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, let's put that aside then, because I think we both have thoughts on that. But I guess I'd like to just maybe frame, or let me try and relay your position back to you, just to make sure I'm understanding. So you're saying we should look at this, in other words, as a problem to be solved, right? Like, which moral theory is going to give us the best outcomes at the end of the day? Okay. Sorry.
I wouldn't say that that's the problem. I wouldn't say that the problem is we need to figure out which moral theory is going to give us the best outcomes, because frankly, I think that problem's already been solved. And the solution is that there is no one perfect morality. All there is error correction and discussion. And whether you want to call that consequentialism or virtue ethics or whatever, it doesn't really matter to me, as long as we recognize that there is only ever debate and criticism and the mutual error correcting mechanisms of conversation. And then after that, then you have a shit ton of problems to be solved. So, for example, at what age should people legally be allowed to consent to having sex? Say, this is not a trivial question, and this is now a problem to be solved that we can only ever discuss and debate. So, sorry, I just wanted to.
Interesting. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're a consequentialist in as much as you think that it provides, on average, the best explanations or the best mechanism by which to make moral decisions at the moment. Would that say? So are you viewing it as almost a hypothesis? Like if we're going to cast a Karl Popper kind of glow onto this conversation, right? Is it sort of your best hypothesis at the moment, and you will now scrutinize it against available evidence and see how it performs, sort of thing? Is this? It's like a.
It's almost that I can't conceive of a system which doesn't use argumentation and discussion and debate to make progress, because to even try to convince me otherwise, the only mechanism one would have is argumentation, discussion, and debate. And so, frankly, what I see is virtue ethics and deontology, and even the word consequentialism is kind of just missing the point slightly. If you're going to engage in philosophical discussions in a philosophy seminar, you are already participating in the mechanisms which I'm advocating are the ones that should be used to make progress. And so if someone wants to convince somebody of the value of deontology, the very act of convincing and discussing would be them participating in what I'm saying is the only way that we can make progress in the first place.
Okay.
I don't know. Am I being unclear? Perhaps.
No, I think we're just talking maybe at slightly two different levels. So I'd like to reduce this down to when you're making a very explicit moral decision, right? So let's say,
Great. Yeah.
I've never been good at coming up with thought experiments off the top of my head, but let me do my best here. So you're just like sitting at a desk, and someone has left their wallet out. Oh, there's like $40 of cash, right, lying there.
Yep.
And the consequentialist probably looks at this. Let's make it even more stark. Like, let's just go, like, the utilitarian looks at this and says, this $40 of cash could probably do the most good if I was just to, like, buy, or, like, donate it to a charity that's going to buy bed nets with it and distribute it to sub-Saharan Africa or something. Mm-hmm. And from that viewpoint, that's just the best thing to do, right? Then the deontologist says, no, because that would be theft, and theft is wrong. Instead, I should just try and find out who this is, and if I can't find it out, I should just leave it, or something like that. The virtue ethicist says something similar. And I'm talking about how we go about reasoning, how we go about making that moral decision, right? So should you only take into account your team's vote on the issue, or should your decision-making process be some sort of weighted average among these different viewpoints? Right.
Yeah. Great example. So you see a wallet on the desk next to you, or on the street, and it has $40 in it, and the question is, like, what do you do?
Exactly.
What would I do in this situation? It depends, of course, on the situation. So if it's my desk mate, I would give it back to them. That would be that's an absolute no-brainer. Okay. Even though, I could take the $40 and donate it to bed nets in Africa, but I could also just sell the guy's desk and donate that money to bed nets in Africa, too, right? But there's a very real forcing function of just manners and culture.
But this is getting too complicated. We need to just simplify. Yeah. No one's going to know you took the money. The money's just sitting there. You're in some wasteland. Okay. It's possible if you don't take the money, no one's going to take it. But right, so the utilitarian's like, well, I could definitely do the most good with this money. Don't take social considerations into account, right? No one's going to know you stole it. It's not going to degrade, the social system around you or anything and lead to anarchy or anything like this, right? It's just purely like a function of distributing it to kids in Africa or just not stealing it, right?
So I would give it back to the person, and something similar happened to me on Friday, where I got in a bit of a work argument with a friend of mine ended up getting a bit more personal than it should have gotten. And I was still quite miffed over the weekend, but I decided to go for coffee with him and apologize. So my act of apologizing was purely because I felt so bad about how I had acted that I knew that the consequences of me like not apologizing would be that I would just continue to feel guilty for quite some time. Similarly with this wallet example, I would give the money back only because I know I have this little inner voice that would cause me to feel guilty if I didn't do that. Other people may have a different inner voice that would say, no, I absolutely should take the $40 and send it to the Effective Altruist Movement, or like Will McCaskill, donate 75% of his wealth to charity. But in all cases, like I would absolutely just think through, to the best of my ability, the consequences of the various actions and what the likely effect that would have both on other people, but also on myself. There's nothing wrong with taking oneself into consideration. Yeah. And I would say that the most honest answer is that in almost all cases, all moral questions that actually arise in my life, I take the action which I think will mitigate harm to other people, but it will also mitigate my own feeling of guilt and unease, which would be created. This is like the inner voice, which some philosophers have talked about, the one that kind of keeps you on the acting ethically. So I don't know. That's my genuine answer. But perhaps you, what would you do in this situation?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know, but I guess I'm just curious as to why, given that there are many like moral philosophers whose job purportedly it is to just like think about morality pretty hard all day, and they are not consequentialists, right? So I guess how do you, because your answer in short was like, I just think about the consequences. So you're just like, you're acting like a consequentialist purely.
Think about the consequences, but I would weigh into consideration like the consequences of my own guilt on my own life.
Sure, so,
yeah. Of course, I would do my best to think through like what the various consequences of the various actions would be, and then take the one which mitigated the worst consequences. But I just, maybe it's a failure of understanding on my part, but I don't see how anyone could ever do anything otherwise. Frankly, like even the virtue ethicist at some point would say something like the consequences of acting with kindness must outweigh the consequences of acting with cruelty. Yeah. And the deontologist, upon arriving at the golden rule or the categorical imperative or whatever, has come up with these because of the consequences. Like, I don't see any other option. Yeah. And which is why I don't even know how to really engage with the other side, because I don't think that there is another side. I think that the people who say that they're on the other side just don't really recognize the mechanisms that are actually going on in their own head when they're reasoning.
Right, perfect. Okay, but this is precisely the question of epistemic modesty, right? So you're casting value judgments on how forceful, how true their actual opinion is, right? And the question is, how are you justified in doing this? There's people who feel equally as strongly as you and are, equally as smart, equally as rational, and have just like completely adopted the other position, right? The deontological position. And so how can you justify from like an outside point of view your perspective on this, right? So that's the question behind epistemic modesty, right? So like
I have to ask. Oh, that's so good. How do I justify my position? The answer is I don't justify it. I never justify it. I can't justify it. All I can do is state it and have other people criticize it. But this is the big thing which both Yukowski and the other guy got wrong, which is that the goal is never to find some position which you can justify perfectly forever, or to find some authority which tells you what to believe and what is true. That is never the case, and I don't justify any of my opinions. I try my best to explain them to other people and have them criticize them. But there is no ultimate justification or source of knowledge or true belief. There's no such thing. There's just your honest expression of what you think and your openness and willingness to hear the other people criticize it to oblivion. And so the answer is I don't justify it. And if you don't agree with my belief, then please join me in criticizing it, and we'll criticize it together.
Right. Okay.
This is my
Yeah, this is good. This is good. So, from my perspective, these are two slightly different things, right? One, okay, let's think of like the arena of ideas, say, right? And it seems to me what you're saying is like, I'm going to take my perspective on this problem and I'm going to cast it out into the arena of ideas, and then people will criticize it and we'll see which ones withstand scrutiny the most.
Exactly.
And then the best idea will sort of come out, right? This is like the battleground of ideas, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so so there's a question here of like whether your personal perspective should be the one that you are putting out into the arena of ideas. So let me give you another thought experiment. You and your roommate, so someone bought a bag of apples or something, and there's an apple sitting in the kitchen. And you went into the kitchen at one point and you thought it was a red apple, and your roommate went to the kitchen at some point and you thought it was a green apple. Now, let's say your roommate and you are like equally as smart, equally as rational, and you were in the kitchen for the same amount of time. You have the exact same amount of information about the situation, right? And so your perspective is, look, the apple is red, right? And so the idea that you can put out into the arena to be criticized is like the apple is red. But there's also a question of like your subjective confidence in your answer. And I think in this situation, your confidence should be precisely 50-50. There's no good reason from an outside view that you should actually hold that the apple is red more so than it's green. The situation's completely symmetric, right? Any reason I give, a good way to maybe think about it is if I'm coming in as a third party, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you, was the apple red or green? And you're going to give me a set of reasons as to why the apple's red. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, and your roommate's going to give me a set of reasons explaining why the apple's green, right? And I have no more reason, assuming that both of you have the exact same amount of information, to believe either one of you. And so my credence as an exterior third party is going to be 50-50 split between whether the apple was red or whether the apple was green. And so I think there's a distinction to be made here between like the idea that you sort of put forward to be criticized by other people and the actual sort of subjective thought that you have about the situation.
100%. I completely agree with you. And I want to suggest perhaps a useful distinction that is not at all made in the Bayesian philosophy and in the kind of the blog posts that surround effective altruist movement and Miri and all that. And that's the difference between truth and certainty. Truth and certainty. So truth is a property of statements. So the statement the apple is red and the statement the apple is green, one of these statements has a property of truth associated with it and the other has a property of falsity associated with it. But from subjective, for subjective agents, we don't know which of these statements has that property associated with it. So truth is an objective property of statements, but certainty is a subjective property of psychology.
Right.
And so it is 100% true to say that you say the apple's red, I say it's green, and the appropriate amount of certainty to have is 50-50. Because neither of us know. But if we then wanted to find out what the truth of the matter is, then we have mechanisms to do so. The mechanisms are experimental tests, argumentation, debate, and all the mechanisms which I'm continuing to hammer on about. But this distinction is perfectly clear in my mind, that in many cases, the right amount of certainty to have is 50-50 or even less than that. And that's kind of why the taxation example was a good one. Like there is a truth of the matter
right.
to if raising the taxes beyond a certain point is beneficial or detrimental to society. But my degree of certainty that I have associated with this is very low because I don't have nearly enough information.
Right.
And so the epistemic modesty question, I think, conflates these two things, and it says you should be more certain as the truth value of a particular statement goes up. It fails to make this distinction,
right.
And so it just talks about our subjective belief, this number between 0 and 1, being associated with certain statements, and if we don't know what, if we're subjectively uncertain, then we just can't say anything about the truth value of any of this stuff. And so the Apple example is quite an easy one, which is, how certain should I be? Exactly 50-50. If we needed to figure this out, if there's lives on the line determining the truth value of whether the apple was red or green, then we switch into investigation mode, and we have the tools that we know through science and through philosophy and through epistemology to ascertain which of these two statements is true. But given the setup, absolutely, of course, the amount of certainty we should have is 50-50. Yes. That's my framing. But I don't know, does that satisfy you, or does that kind of like not really get at the nub of the issue?
No, that's good. I mean, so now the question in more complicated areas, right, is like, are we justified in having increased certainty in any of our like moral explanations or political explanations, yeah. Right? Like, and I guess your claim, if I'm not getting you wrong, is that consequentialism has been a better explanation for a lot of, or rather has led to like better moral outcomes or something than other explanations, and therefore we should have a higher degree of certainty in it, sort of thing.
My claim is that the only way we can ever make progress is by subjecting ideas to this arena.
Right.
And consequentialism is, I think, the only one of the three mechanisms that doesn't impede this process. The other mechanisms, I think, in almost all cases, they are just doing it anyways. But which is why I think that everyone's just participating in this, whether they recognize it or not. But with virtue ethics and deontology, it impedes it a little bit, and it impedes it in the sense of saying that there is some final authoritative answer which can be ascertained, and which, upon having it, would end moral discussion forever. It's like, imagine if we found the deontological rule. Imagine if we were given it by God. This would end all discussions, because we would just look at the rule. And if the rule was written down in tablet form, all we would have to do is open up the book and be told how to act. And if instead of the rule being one rule, it was 10, then it could cause 2,000 years of unhappiness and misery. Because it ends and impedes the kind of discussion which I'm arguing is the only thing which drives forward moral progress.
Okay.
So, yes.
Yeah, I keep trying to get you to admit that you could have these kind of discussions with like a deontologist, but I don't think that's going to happen. So
no, but to have a discussion with a deontologist is to participate in the thing that I'm saying is the only way that we drive forward progress. Yes.
Okay, so let's take let's take two different brands of consequentialism then. Okay, yeah. So let's say one is taking only the consequences of people that are alive right now. Those are the kind of consequences you're taking into account, right? So this is called a person-affecting moral view. You're concerned about affecting people who are alive right now, right? Then there's non-person affecting views, which says like you should just be concerned about like the total amount of well-being, regardless of whether these people are alive right now or not. So if they live in the future, that's fine. We shouldn't be discounting them morally simply because they just don't exist right now. They will exist in the future. These sorts of things. And so you can have consequentialist frameworks that adopt person-affecting views or non-person affecting views. Okay, so how do you discriminate between these kind of things?
This is tough. Yeah, this is like legitimately really difficult. To make the question like applicable, do we want to count the life of the unborn fetus, or do we not?
Right.
Which is, do we want to take into account the well-being of those in the future? Right.
You've just crossed somehow the political and moral boundary. We're just somewhere in the middle.
But like, I think the term you're using is person-affecting view. Like, do we only consider the consequences and the suffering of the people who are alive now, or do we also include all of the potential future pleasure and suffering and unhappiness of those yet to be born? If I understood the distinction correctly.
Yeah.
If you just want to know my perspective, it's very difficult. We don't have a clear answer to this question
right.
yet.
Yeah.
In some sense, I would say that it depends on the situation, and there will it seems like you're seeking for a moral system which will forever end all of your struggles, which you could just turn to the system and read off the answers and be told how to act. And I'm basically making the case that at no point we will ever get this, nor should we actually even desire it. And all we can ever do is debate and discuss through the difficulties of our world right now. And so my direct answer to you when you say what kind of consequentialist am I is that these distinctions don't matter to me at all. Like it's a tough question, and I don't have an easy answer about how much we should include into consideration the lives of the unborn. Like, obviously we want to include it a little bit, but do I want to weigh the life of the blastocyst equally to the life of the teenage mother? Probably not. But do I want to live in a world where Thanos can just snap his fingers and people extinguish without suffering, and therefore that's completely fine because there's no suffering? Well, obviously that doesn't make any sense either. And so I think that the search for some perfect moral framework or some perfect set of rules or some perfect update rule to follow is a search for an authority figure. It's a search for some fount of wisdom, which will then allow us to offload our thinking to it. And I reject all such sources. All we can ever do is reason and discuss in the moment. So
I agree. But okay, but this is good. Epistemic modesty is precisely this. When you're saying this is a hard question, I'm not sure what to do. This is precisely when epistemic modesty is supposed to kick into high gear, right? What happens most of the time is that we pick a side. We just say like, well, fuck future people. I don't care, and I'm concerned about the people living right now, right? So climate change is a problem insofar as current generations are concerned, right? Or we pick the side that says, oh no, actually we should like value generations of the future with some discount function, with the discount rate equal to 0.27 times pi over 2, right? And then some people say, no, the discount function should be 1 or something. And the question is like precisely what to do under these situations when we're like, we intuitively think one answer is correct, right? So maybe you're like, and most people naturally are sort of hold person-affecting views. That's sort of like the natural moral position to take, is like you care about what happens to people alive right now. But the question is, like, upon reflection, a lot of people actually like ditch these views in favor of non-person affecting views. And so how should we hold our subjective credences in different ways to act given this disagreement in the moral realm, right?
I can see that we frame moral questions slightly differently, which makes for such an interesting discussion because, like, I think you think that I just chosen consequentialism because it's like this is the thing that I'm just gonna die attached to. But really, I just see that we can never have a perfect moral framework which will allow us to offload our thinking. And consequentialism isn't that. Consequentialism is the only one which doesn't promise to offer that. Consequentialism is unfortunately just it's an overused term now, but it just means having to think through these questions yourself. And that's all I mean by a consequentialist, is having to think through these questions yourself, case by case, instance by instance, incrementally. And so, like, how much we should tune the discount factor is just, again, trying to find some authority to do our thinking for us. And that is not ever the way that we should think, nor will it ever work, because moral questions are precisely those questions which are contextual, which are there is no 100% right or wrong answer to the question of like, should you take a life? Well, obviously it depends. There will always be complications, and morality in some sense is just a system and a framework to be able to navigate through a world where such complications will continuously arise. If we didn't have these kind of complications, we wouldn't need a moral framework because there would be no use of it. And so all I'm saying is that there is no real distinction between a scientific mindset and a moral one, because in both of these cases, a scientific mindset and, say, a consequentialist one, because in both of these cases, you're just doing your best to try to reason through problems using the tools of critical discussion. And at no point can we ever say we have found that which will give us all the answers. And the search for that, I think, is just, it's misguided in the best case, but it's just kind of creepy in the worst case, which is like, please tell me how to think. Give me the thing which will solve these problems for me. And I never want that, even if it was offered. Yeah.
I'm confused. I don't understand. Wait, so where... Yeah, so you keep bringing up like this plea to a higher authority to give us moral answers. Where am I appealing to that? Like,
no, I'm saying that I think you're kind of appealing to that and saying like, dude, like, what is your moral system? Just tell me if you're like, what kind of consequentialist are you? Okay, you're the kind of consequentialist who is going to include the future rate of people by a discount factor of 0.37. Okay, great. So I know that's the kind of consequentialist you are. And so whenever you have a problem, you're just going to apply your discount rate you're going to weigh up all of and then there's the answer to your problem. So the plea to the authority is a plea to find some, which I'm not saying is you necessarily. I'm saying that this is kind of a common trope within ethical conversations. But the virtue ethicist wants to find that set of virtues which, upon being followed, will always be the right thing to do. The deontologist wants to find the rule or the set of rules, and they argue that it's really difficult, but they want a rule. Give them a fucking rule, and once they have that rule, then they just have to follow the rule. It's rule following. It's word following. It's virtue following. It's discount rate applying.
Okay.
All of these are appeals to have your thinking done elsewhere.
Yeah, okay, I think I'm thinking more short-term decision by decision. So, like, back to the wallet thing, right? Like, it seems to me, given a situation, an isolated situation, if you were to just, like, sit and have a long reflection about what you think the best thing to do is, you can brand in that situation, as a function of that situation, what exactly you think the thing to do is. So, given the wallet, you think the thing to do is consequentialism, person affecting consequentialism with like some discount rate, whatever, right? And I'm not saying this is your answer for all time, right? I'm not trying to appeal to saying because you think that in this situation, you should extrapolate that and always think that this is the best moral framework. Someone's moral framework could precisely be a function that changes with time or something. Like I'm not opposed to that, or that changes with how our consciousness evolves, things like this, right? All I'm saying is situation by situation, we have moral intuitions about how we're supposed to act in this moment. And the question is, should you only follow this moral intuition, or should you be taking into account viewpoints that literally make no intuitive sense to you? Because by taking an outside view, you have like sort of no way of knowing that you're right. And so should you be taking into account people who would say completely opposite things, even if their arguments don't seem to make as much sense? Right, that's the question.
Of course, yeah. So I think we've converged
nice.
A bit more, which is at any point we should always take into account the critical arguments of other people, precisely when they're maximally different from ourselves. Because at every point, I assume that my views are some mixture of truth and error.
Right.
But I don't know what exactly I'm wrong about, and so all I can do is appeal to other people. And so the answer is always yes. You always have to take into account other people's views, but to take into account means to listen to them carefully and then see if they have a valid criticism or not. And if they don't, then sometimes you discount it, and if they do, then you try to learn from it. But the answer is yes, of course you do. And the only reason I'm arguing so strongly for this mechanism is because this mechanism assures that will always be taking place. This is the only one which is able to be influenced by other people's views. And if the deontologist wants to argue with me or argue with somebody, then absolutely I want to hear what they have to say. Of course, like maybe I'm wrong, but I just see that the very act of them arguing is evidence of the fact that they are participating in the very thing that I'm saying is what I value, which is argumentation. And so, yes, absolutely, we need to always take into account people who are thinking differently than us. And the only this is such a foundational principle in my life because I always try to express my views clearly, precisely so that other people can attack them as savagely as possible.
Right.
And therefore, the part of the responsibility of that is that you always have to listen to the criticisms of other people, and you always have to listen to other people's views, because if you aren't listening to them, then this whole mechanism breaks down. Of course, you have to listen to other people and seek it out, and yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think, this framework makes sense, right? What you're describing definitely makes sense when you can put an idea out there to be criticized and you can converge closer and closer to some objective truth, right? But there's some situations, especially in the moral realm, where this sort of consensus is never going to happen, right? So often people will put ideas out there and you're just not going to agree about whose life matters most in this case, or about which consequences are more important than other consequences, right? Some people will be like, well, this is just unjust, and that's a consequence that we can't allow this to happen, right? Injustice rather trumps everything else, right? And so the question is, I think it's more interesting when it comes to these cases where there's just such intuitive disagreement about different things, and then you still have to make a decision, right? And the question is, what decision do you make when there's this kind of just inconsistency across the board, right?
I think that's actually a bit of a. I don't think that's necessarily true that consensus doesn't emerge through moral debate. I think that it does. It just emerges a lot more slowly and over the span of about a century. And so, for example, nobody left or right is really arguing about the validity of seatbelt laws anymore, or the validity of whether or not drinking and driving is a bad idea. That debate is over, and everyone has converged. A lot of the debates that we're currently still having, I think, are because the right answers haven't really come out yet.
Right.
I would say that the most recent one would be gay marriage, which is, I think, almost conversation which everybody has agreed, at least in the West, and even Donald Trump, with all of his let's say character flaws, hasn't really touched this issue at all. It's just one that's boring to everybody now. The conservative leader in Canada has said that that's an issue they don't really want to touch, and so I think that consensus does happen, but it happens slowly. But I would also say that consensus isn't actually even the thing that we necessarily want.
Right,
we just want the emergence of moral truths, which come, but I think just slowly. The question of slavery, who's arguing on the pro-slavery side anymore? But there is civil wars fought about this, and so I think that it does happen. It just takes centuries.
But you're kind of kicking the ball further downfield, right? So you're definitely not going to catch me in a position where I'm arguing against the progress we've made. I think we've made astonishing progress in basically every realm, right? But the question is, we still have to make decisions right now, right? We have to make decisions about about admissions, for example, to post-secondary institutions, right? And so what should our hiring practices be when it comes to like minorities and people who are underprivileged and things like this, right? So we have to make these decisions, and there's huge amounts of disagreement here, right? And so, so when someone has an opinion on this, the question is like, given this amount of disagreement, how confident should you be in your opinion, given that there's like equally sort of rational people arguing with equal fervor and equal commitment on the other side, right?
Well, I think that like the idea of confidence and certainty is totally an interesting one, but I don't think that it's the same as how should you act. So with a lot of these questions, I think it's fair to say that our confidence levels should be quite low. But whenever you act in anything, you have to have some sort of threshold. And so I think that the threshold has to be low as well, basically, which is, unfortunately, we have to make some sort of decision on college admin procedures. And nobody really knows conclusively what the best decision is going to be. Should we continue to do affirmative action, or should we just purely hire based on merit, or should we hire based on like class-based affirmative action? These are very difficult questions which we don't have concrete answers to. And so the confidence level we should have is low. Yeah, of course. But we still need to act. And so the threshold for action should also be lower, given that inaction is still action, and inaction is going to do something as well. And so for these kind of questions, if it's more of like a procedural, what is the best procedure to have when the outcome is uncertain, when you're uncertain, when truths are not yet emerged? The best procedure, I think, is incremental, short-term, and reversible. And so you try something temporarily, kind of see what the effects are, and then you reassess. And so this kind of takes place in the context of like, I know in governments, often policies have sunset laws. Mm-hmm. So rather than being put in place and then they have to be actively taken out. Like I think the Patriot Act, I may be wrong about this, but I think the Patriot Act had a sunset clause, which is if it wasn't renewed after X amount of time, then it would be canceled. And so after X amount of time, they had to continue to vote to keep putting it on. I may be wrong about that particular act, but the Googleable term is sunset clause. But this is the one mechanism to be able to act in the face of uncertainty. But this is, I think, it's a different, not a different question, but I don't think that it's one which needs to cripple us necessarily. We just need to come up with mechanisms to make decisions when there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, you bring up one fascinating point, which I think we should honestly maybe sidebar for like another conversation. I think we could do a whole episode on this, which is the difference between incremental or what Popper called like piecemeal engineering versus radical reform, right? And like what are the pros and cons? Are there ever times where we do want radical reform? And anyway, I've been thinking about this a bit recently, so I think like we should definitely talk about that just separately at some point, which is fascinating. But I think as maybe like a final point, what you bring up, I think, is one of the biggest problems I have with this notion of epistemic modesty, and that is, precisely the conflation between how we should present our opinions to the public and how we should internally hold our positions. And so there's this notion of like wisdom of the crowds, right? Like often if you take, which is like quantifiable to a certain extent, right? So if you take a bunch of people and people are sort of more likely on average to have the right answer, if you like aggregate people's opinions, you will get the right answer emerging over time, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think you can make the argument that it's actually not helpful if we were to all be epistemically modest, if we were to all be uncertain in our actions all the time, because what this does is like sort of reduce this battleground of ideas to be much more sort of diluted than it should be otherwise. Mm-hmm. And almost what you want is like the strongest versions of different positions playing out against each other to see which ones emerge. And I think that's probably most helpful actually in terms of making positions. So I think there should be this distinction between like, precisely the position like we do put forward and the position that we hold personally. And so this is like a fascinating difference, I think, that hasn't really been dealt with in this or by any of these pieces.
It's like, it's like the I know we're passing the hour mark, so we should consider winding up soonish, but I love the idea of the battleground of ideas, because I think you can just envision like battle bots, and it's a useful metaphor for this distinction which I'm trying to make between subjective certainty and like the objective battle of ideas, where frankly, I don't care how certain or uncertain any of the controllers of the battle bots are.
Exactly.
They can all be completely uncertain, as long as they're trying their best to push these ideas into the arena so that they can all fight and we can start to all learn. But people can have like epsilon's certainty for all I care, as long as they are trying to put these ideas into the arena.
Yeah.
And in the Bayesian philosophy, which is something, again, we should sidebar for another conversation. This is completely elided. And so you kind of tell when it permeates through all of the writing, which is like, when should you update your belief, and how certain should you be on your belief? But beliefs, the phrase belief makes an unhelpful conflation between your certainty and the truth of a particular statement. So like in the BattleBots analogy, I don't give a shit about what anybody believes, as long as they're doing their very best to put these ideas into the arena. I don't care what you believe. Just do your best to represent these ideas clearly. You could be completely certain on the wrong belief, as long as you're expressing the idea clearly so that it can have a fair hearing. And so that's one of the things which we should, again, pick up next conversation, like why this conflation is unhelpful, because let me rephrase that. Why the distinction between truth, certainty, and belief needs to be very sharply made, and upon making that distinction, I think it clears up so much confusion that needn't be there when that distinction is made. So maybe that'll be like my concluding remark. But yeah, anything else, my friend? This was a fun one. Before we sign off.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Yeah. This would be like fun to come back to. I think, especially on the more political side. I think we got pretty detailed when it came to like moral epistemic modesty. But I think it'd be interesting just to think through about how we justify political opinions, and even just to dive into personal opinions that we hold. Yeah, well, we are on stuff and this kind of thing. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, we can even just pick this up again in a couple weeks on the same subject after thinking about it. Cool. Well, let's sign off and pick it up again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, cool. Take care, man.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.